Welcome. I am John T. Walsh Jr., lecturer at the Community College of Rhode Island, and I will be your instructor for the course of Law and Society for this semester, which is the fall of 2020. And this lecture is to go along with the handout for week one. It is the first in a series that I'll be making as we go through the semester. And what I would like to do today is to begin by talking about the Constitution and the Supreme Court. As we go through the course, a large part of what we'll be dealing with are issues that are controlled by the federal government and the Congress, and which have been ruled upon by the Supreme Court in their various decisions and their various cases over the year. And so I'd like to make sure that everybody has a basic understanding of how the Constitution works and how the Supreme Court works before we get into talking specifics about various issues. For those of you who have had constitutional law or who have had these types of matters covered in other courses, I apologize, but I just feel it's helpful for the folks who have not. I find that many of you come out of high school with very limited knowledge as to how the government works and what courts do and what the Constitution does and all of that good stuff that you should have gotten in grade school and junior high school. So I just think it's useful for a number of people to go through some of the basics so that we're all starting out on kind of an even playing field as we begin discussing the issues. So going along with week one's lecture, first I want to give you a little bit of history. The United States Constitution came about after the Revolutionary War in response to a real void of power that existed. The 13 states that initially made up the United States of America were originally British colonies. They had been settled mostly in the early 1600s. And at that point in time, there was no such thing as political correctness. There was no real awareness of the rights of the indigenous peoples who were already here in North America as the British arrived. The British came with their laws, their religion, and their culture, and their methods of economics and agriculture, and basically made every attempt to transplant those things here and to recreate British society and British culture on this continent. They did not look to the indigenous peoples to offer them any advice or assistance in this endeavor. And by the time the mid-1700s had come along, in the years just before the Revolution, basically what existed from New Hampshire down through Georgia was a British society made up of people who considered themselves English, who considered themselves subjects of the British king, and who looked upon themselves as being rightful controllers and owners of this continent at this point in time. Now, things went along well between the colonists and the British, by and large, the British at home and the British government and monarchy for the first 100 or so years of the settlements here. And the differences between them really only began to develop after something called the 7 Years' War in Europe and called the French and Indian War here in North America. At the time of the mid-1700s, there were three great empires which controlled large portions of the world, and they were the French Empire, the Spanish, and the British. I suppose we should also include the Portuguese Empire, which was rather large at that point, but the Portuguese Empire had no real foothold in North America. In North America, it was the French, the British, and the Spanish who were vying for control. In the 7 Years' War, the British and the French basically fought each other to nearly the death. And in some ways, the 7 Years' War was the First World War, because instead of fighting each other primarily on their own territories, much of the fighting went on the ocean between their navies and in their various colonies around the world. In North America, leading up to the war, the French controlled what is now Quebec and most of what we can look at as of eastern Canada. The provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island were largely French at that point in time, as well as Quebec. And the French influence went through their traders and through their trading posts across the Great Lakes, down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, and of course New Orleans was a large seaport at the mouth of the Mississippi River, already a great trading and shipping city, and that was in French control as well at this point in time. There were a number of battles fought out on the North American continent between the British and the French. The city of Pittsburgh was founded as a fort right on the border between what was then French-held territory and British territory. There were a number of raids made by French soldiers combined with Native Americans into New England. Towns like Springfield and Deerfield were invaded. They were burned. People were killed and taken hostage, taken captive. The New England militias, state militias, organized a couple of expeditions up to Quebec to attempt to seize territory there. So there was a great amount of fighting done in North America, a large amount of battling. People felt like they were fighting for their lives. And the war ended finally with the British winning with a decisive victory over the French. And as part of that victory, the French basically left North America. They gave up their holdings in North America, so that what is now all of Canada became British, and the French gave up their control of the Mississippi Valley settlements and basically left in North America the British colonies that went from Georgia north up at that now up to Hudson Bay and up to Newfoundland, and the Spanish controlling territory on the far side of the Mississippi River through the Southwest and California down towards Mexico. The war was extremely expensive for Great Britain. Even though they won, they were basically nearly bankrupt at the end of the war, so the British Parliament and the British Crown were looking for ways to raise revenue. Prior to this time, the colonies in North America had been pretty much left alone by the British government. They regulated their own affairs. Each colony had its own legislature that made laws and regulations. Many of the colonies had a governor appointed by the king to control them, but a number of them actually elected their own governors, or the governors were chosen by the state legislatures. The vast majority of taxes were collected on the local level or the state level, and in terms of taxation by Britain, it was very much limited to taxing the shipment of goods back and forth between England and North America, so that the average person could go many months, sometimes many years, depending what type of trade they were involved in, what their business was, without directly suffering or feeling British taxes. Now, trying to raise money, Parliament began to change that, and they passed a number of laws trying to increase the taxes on the colonies. These, of course, were resented and resisted. The resistance led to things like the Boston Tea Party, where a number of subjects in Boston, British subjects in Boston, dressed up as Native Americans, boarded a British ship and threw cartons of tea upon which a high tax had been placed into the bay to protest. Eventually, it led to things like the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers who were occupying Boston fired on colonists, killing several of them, and the basic relations between the 13 colonies and England began to deteriorate to the point where the colonies created something called a Continental Congress, and each sent delegates there, and this Congress began, first of all, trying to negotiate with Britain, but then finally, after 1776 and the issuing of the Declaration of Independence, the main purpose of the Continental Congress became seeking independence and separation from England, and the basic rejection of the British monarchy and the ending of any power of the monarchy in the North American colonies. The Revolutionary War was fought for 5 years. It was touch and go for a very long time, And the French, looking to get back at their loss in the Seven Years' War to the British, came to the aid of the North American colonies, and eventually the British Army was surrounded by the French fleet and the Continental Army and forced to withdraw back to England, and the 13 colonies gained their independence. Now, beginning at that point in time, each of the states was basically a independent country, separate to itself. And they began to develop controversies between the states. They began to try to impose tariffs so that goods moving from Rhode Island to Massachusetts or Massachusetts to Rhode Island would be taxed as they crossed the border. They each created their own currencies. They were issuing paper money that had nothing to back it, and that was of dubious value, but states like Rhode Island made it illegal to use anything but Rhode Island paper money in Rhode Island transactions. And there was a constant threat. The British Navy, the Spanish Navy, the French navies were still in control of the Atlantic. The American Navy was mostly non-existent, with only a couple of ships, and the American merchants were now subject to seizure and harassment by the British fleet after having for hundreds of years had their protection. So there was also the fear that at some point a British or French or Spanish fleet would show up in Philadelphia Harbor or Boston Harbor or Charleston Harbor and would attempt to take over these newly independent but very small and very weak states. So many people, particularly among the merchant class, the property class, the plantation owner class, they realized that something needed to be done, and they began to seek ways to unite the 13 colonies into one government, one entity that would have some power, would be able to raise an army, and would prevent the breaking up of the economy into 13 separate little spheres. At first, they created something called the Articles of Confederation government. The Articles of Confederation allowed each state to send representatives to a Congress. This Congress was very limited in its powers, however. It had no ability to tax. It had to depend on the state legislatures to give it money when it was needed. It had very limited control over the state militias and very limited ability to pass laws that would be enacted or enforced in all the states. It took a supermajority of the state delegations to enact any law, and for many issues there was an absolute veto where one state, like little dinky Rhode Island or Delaware, could veto something that all the other states wanted. So the Article of Confederation government was extremely weak, was a little bit better than having no united government at all, but basically was not resolving the issues that existed. The dangers that were faced by the states and the state governments were kind of crystallized by something called Shays' Rebellion, which took place in western Massachusetts in the mid-1780s. The economy basically collapsed in many of these states after the Revolutionary War. They no longer were able to trade with England. They still had not established trade relations with other countries or the other empires. And so the economies took a tremendous hit in western Massachusetts. Farmers were losing their farms for inability to pay their mortgages or to pay their taxes to the town. And finally, it reached the point that a man called Shays organized a militia, and this militia began to occupy town halls and the county courthouses to shut down the courts and to prevent the seizing of farms from the farmers who were unable to pay their bills. This rebellion went on for some time. Initially, the folks in Boston were unable to defeat it or to contain it. They requested help from the governors of the surrounding states, all of whom happily refused to give any help. And for a while, it looked like the Massachusetts government might be overthrown by a revolution. The folks in Boston eventually were able to raise a militia, were eventually able to take back control, but this whole incident had taught all of the colonies and all the colonial governments a lesson that individually they were very weak, and that if they did not do something to unite together to protect themselves, to protect each other and to get the economy moving again, there would be great issues and possibly further revolution and revolt ahead. So they called a convention. Each of the states, except Rhode Island, sent delegates to this convention in Philadelphia, and the goal of this convention was to come up with a form of government that would be acceptable to the colonies, now independent states, where they could unite and come up with some form of being able to work together and to protect themselves and each other. The result of this conference was, or this Congress was, the writing of our Constitution. Now, when they were writing the Constitution, these folks had several things in mind. Primarily, one of the things they had in mind was they did not want any new government to gain the power and control that the British government had attempted to exact over their lives. They wanted taxation to be controlled. They wanted the ability to regulate individual rights and to control the states to be controlled. So while they wanted this federal government, this central government, to have certain powers and certain abilities, they also wanted to make sure that it did not become despotic or tyrannical, as they had come to view the British Parliament and the British King being towards them. So in the writing of the Constitution, this control of power became an ever constant thought, an ever constant thing at the back of the minds of the delegates. And in order to make sure that power was controlled and regulated, they came up with two different ideas that they worked into the Constitution in ways that still exist very much so today. Much of the basic governmental structure that was established by the Constitution has not changed. Even though we've had 27 amendments to the Constitution, the basic idea is still in place. It is still there. The two ideas that were written into this document were, one, separation of powers, that they did not want one person or one group or one part of the government to become all-powerful, so that governmental control would be spread over what came to be, in the final version, 3 branches of government. So this separation of powers was supposed to mean that no part of the government would ever have absolute control over all aspects of life and the law and the court system. The other thing that they wrote in was something called checks and balances. So while they wanted each part of the government to have independence and to have a certain amount of power that only it would control and regulate, they also wanted the ability of the other 2 branches to be able to stop any one branch from getting total control or total power. And basically, they did this by setting up a system where, and if you look at the chart, I have a chart in the handouts that shows the basic structure that was set up by the Constitution. The 3 branches of government were the Congress, made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the executive, which is made up of the executive branch being the president, who is both head of all of the governmental agencies and commander-in-chief of the military, and then there was the court system, the head of which was the Supreme Court, and which today has been fleshed out to comprise the appellate courts and the various district courts that exist in each state, along with specialized courts such as admiralty and tax courts. In spreading the powers among the different branches, Congress was given the power to enact legislation, to make laws. However, those laws would be subject to the veto of the president. The president's veto was not absolute, however. If Congress were able to gather a 2/3 vote in both houses, they could override a veto of a law by the president. The Congress was given the sole ability to raise taxes. As a matter of fact, the House of Representatives is the only part of the government that is allowed to initiate new taxes and is in control over spending. The president was given control over the day-to-day functions of the government, which today have come to mean that the bureaucracies that we all think of, the Internal Revenue Service, Social Security, Health and Human Services, Department of Education, are all basically branches of the government under the control of the president. The president as well was named commander-in-chief of the military, basically making him the top general, the top person in control of how the military was to operate and what they were going to do. The judiciary was given the power to hear cases and controversies and to make decisions. And in order to solidify this power very early on, one of the early chief justices, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, where there was a question about whether certain actions of a Secretary of State were proper or not, the court took to itself the power to interpret the Constitution and to tell the other branches of government basically what the Constitution means. Now, this theory was never completely fleshed out or talked about in the actual document that created the Constitution, that is the Constitution. However, again, very early on, the court took this power to itself under the idea of precedent, where the court system is supposed to follow its own decisions and to not come up with contradictory or conflicting decisions as time goes on. The idea of precedent cemented this in, and basically the other two branches of government have come to accept this idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of interpreting the Constitution, to the point where they can tell the president or they can tell the Congress, no, you cannot do that because the Constitution doesn't allow it. The federal government was given the power to raise certain taxes. It was given the power to certainly raise an army and maintain a military, an army, and a navy. It was given powers over the economy. Congress was given the authority to control tariffs, which basically could only be imposed on goods coming in from other countries. It was given the power to control interstate commerce, so that the regulation of commercial activity between the various states would become part of the federal structure of things, not under state law. Along with the ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances, the Constitution also created something called a federal system. And the idea here was that the federal government was not to become all-powerful, that the state governments were still to have rights and powers, and that many activities would be left to the states. The regulation of property rights, laws about marriage and family life, health and safety, education, probate, and the succession of property after somebody passes away. Many of these things were left to the state governments. The state governments maintained power and control, and over time, these powers basically came to be called the police powers, that the states were the entities that were still primarily responsible for the health, education, safety, and welfare of their peoples, and that the job of the federal government would be to maintain relations with other countries, to maintain a military to protect the nation as a whole, to do certain things to assist the economy, but basically to still leave the states with their power, or another term for that is their sovereignty. So, in effect, the Constitution created a system where there are two governments in every person's life. In America, a minimum of two governments. You have the state government of the state where you live, which still has great authority, power, and control over your lives. And then we are all, in all the various states, subject to the powers and authority of the federal government. But the idea here was that, again, to prevent tyranny, to prevent a dictatorship from arising, that the states would maintain powers, and along with the separation of powers among the three branches, the power of the state would act as a balance, a counterbalance against the power of the federal government. Now, this has been largely eroded in the last 140 years since the passage of the 14th Amendment. However, again, it is still there. You do not get your driver's license from the federal government. only the states have the authority to issue driver's licenses. If you need to get a divorce, you cannot go to federal court, you must go to state court. So even though the state powers have greatly diminished and been greatly eroded over the years, they are still there, and the basic bones of the system still exist. Now, one of the things that the original Constitution did not contain was very much language about our individual rights. Those basically were set out in something called the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And the various things that we think of as our individual rights: freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, the right to bear arms, right to an attorney, the right to against self-incrimination, Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. All of these things were enacted after the initial Constitution was written and ratified by the states, and they came into being very quickly after the new government was set up. And again, I think most Americans today, when they think of the Constitution, they think of the Bill of Rights and the rights contained therein. And certainly as we go through this course, a lot of what we're going to be discussing actually comes from the Bill of Rights, not from the main body of the Constitution itself. I have in the handouts listed a summary of the various items in the Bill of Rights, actually a summary of all the amendments, so you can look it up and see it if you would like. But we will be going into various of these rights and various of these amendments as we go through the semester. For those of you who are interested in learning more about this, more about the Constitution and how it was set up, there is something called the Federalist Papers. At the time of the Revolution, every city and good-sized town had a newspaper that was published daily or weekly, and the colonists mainly were literate. Number of the different colonies that were founded for religious reasons also believed in mandatory education for children. So you had a largely, probably far more literate population in the American colonies than there was anywhere in Europe at that point in time. So people were very much used to getting their newspapers, reading them cover to cover, although most of them were one-page printouts in those days. And again, remember, there was no radio, no TV, no internet, very little in the way of entertainment in terms of theaters or other types of establishments. So getting the newspaper and reading it at night was something that was practiced by many of the colonists. In order to win favor for this new Constitution, in order to help it be ratified, to be voted into existence by the various states, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison got together and began writing under pseudonyms, under John Doe names. They began writing editorials to be sent to the various newspapers in the large cities in the states and to be published. And many newspaper editors liked them, picked up on them, published them, and eventually they were brought together. Now you can buy a book. As a matter of fact, you don't have to buy it. If you go online and look, there's something called the Federalist Society, which offers a free PDF printout of all the Federalist Papers. And in these papers, the people who were there at the time, a couple of whom who actually worked on writing the Constitution at the convention, explain how all of this was supposed to work and what the various phrases and clauses of the Constitution mean. Now, one of the things that was a constant issue, and we will talk about it in several of the week's topics as we go through the semester, was the issue of slavery. Already at the time of the Revolution, this had become a difficult stumbling block in terms of relations between the North and South. The northern states had pretty much abolished slavery by and large at that point, while in the southern states, slavery was not only not abolished, but it was increasing, it was growing as the British moved further to the west and began cultivating more and more land, and particularly cultivating it with crops like tobacco and cotton, which were extremely labor intensive. Remember, these are the days before mechanization. There were no tractors, there were no mechanical plows, There were no vehicles, self-propelled vehicles of any type. So basically, all chores on any type of farm or plantation had to be done by hand, had to be done by manual labor. And unfortunately, in the South, beginning in 1619, when the first slaves were brought from Africa to be sold to people in Virginia, the system of chattel slavery, and particularly of black slavery, and African slavery had developed throughout the South and was one of the main parts of the economy. The British Empire, by the time of the American Revolution, was already dealing with the issue of slavery and was attempting to end it in their colonies. And the Americans saw this, the Southern Americans, the plantation owners saw this, and they were very concerned. They felt that their way of life would be completely destroyed, their economy would be destroyed if slavery were to be terminated, so they fought very hard to make sure that the initial writing of the Constitution did not affect the institution of slavery. On the other hand, the northern states had already given up on slavery. The abolitionist movement had already begun to grow. Many northerners were bitterly opposed to slavery and wanted it ended. But the writers of the Constitution, even the northern writers, realized that if they made this a primary issue, that they would end up with two countries, a northern United States and a southern United States. So, for better or worse, compromises were made. The slave system was allowed to continue in the South. However, they set a date after which there would be no more importation of slaves from Africa. The slave trade would be absolutely banned and terminated. The representation in Congress was divided into two ways. The small states wanted equal representation, whereas the large states wanted representation to be based on population. This conflict almost destroyed the Constitutional Convention and ended the whole process until the Connecticut delegation came up with the system that we have now, whereby we have a Senate, and each state in the Union sends 2 senators to the Senate. So in the Senate, every state is equal, which is somewhat an anomaly and somewhat, in ways, almost ridiculous at this point in time. Little Rhode Island, with its less than 1 million people and its 1,000 square miles of land, smaller than the city or county of Los Angeles, has the same representation in the Senate as the state of California with its 34 million people and its 50-some representatives in Congress. So it's an amazing type thing that was developed, but again, the states at the time of the institution of the Constitution were separate independent nations. There was nothing saying they had to join this new government, so compromises had to be made to keep everybody happy, and the small states were very jealous of their independence and their power. So in the Senate, all states are equal. In the House of Representatives, the number of representatives each state has is determined by the number of people that live in that state. The Southerners were very, very concerned with this, and they wanted the slaves to be counted as individuals for the purpose of picking representatives, because already in a number of areas of the South, the black slaves were the majority of the population. And the Southerners felt that if they only counted free men, that they would be vastly unrepresented in the Congress. This was deeply contested, with the Northerners saying, with I think a logical correctness, that if you don't consider them to be people or citizens, you consider them to be property, how can you let them vote? How can they be considered in counting in a vote? And again, this came close to wrecking the convention, and they came up with a very odious compromise that each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of determining how many representatives would be sent to Washington from the southern states. These contradictions, this tension, was part of the creation of the government under the Constitution. It never went away. And there was a constant tension between the ever-increasing abolitionist movements in the North and the retrenchment and the insistence by the Southerners that their system could not be forced to be changed by outsiders, and that they had the God-given right to continue with what had already existed. This came to be enshrined not in law, but in practice in the Congress. The policy quickly arose where that as new states were created, and the writers of the Constitution had the foresight to see that as the country moved west, the original 13 states would have to give up some of their territorial claims and some of their rights, and that new states would come to be created. And they created a process. They put a process into the Constitution to allow that, and sure enough, within several years after the enactment of the Constitution, new states were coming into being. And in order to maintain the balance between the North and the South, for a very long period of time, every time a state was let in that was a free state, a state would also have to come in that was a slave allowing state. This continued right up into the 1850s. It began to be a hotly contested thing. In Missouri and Kansas, there were basically civil insurrections, civil wars going on in those territories between the free farmers and the slaveholders, both of which groups were trying to move in and to settle those territories. And of course, eventually, the conflict led to the creation of the Republican Party, which had a platform of no further extension of slavery. And it led in 1860 to the election of Abraham Lincoln on that position, that not another inch of territory would be given over to slavery. Now, this had become a very critical issue because in the late 1840s, the United States entered into a war with Mexico. The result of that war was the United States came into control and possession of basically all of what we now call the Southwest and out to Nevada and California. So that there was a vast amount of territory that could be carved into new states. And the Republicans ran on the position that we cannot force the South to abandon slavery in its own existing territory, but we refuse to extend it one more inch. As a matter of fact, one of Lincoln's campaign slogans in his first campaign was "not another inch," meaning there would not be another inch of United States soil given over to the institution of slavery. Even this was enough to upset and scare the Southerners enough that upon Lincoln's election, the Southern states, one by one, first seceded from the Union, basically cut their ties with Washington and said we're no longer part of this government, and then eventually set up something called the Confederate States of America as an opposing government. Abraham Lincoln refused to accept this. His theory of the Constitution was that once a state had joined and become part of the Union, it was forever part of the Union. It did not have the right to secede or leave. Lincoln refused to abandon federal military facilities in the states that had left the Union. He ordered the Union Navy and Union troops to hold on to their facilities. And eventually this led to the attempt by the state of South Carolina to take over Fort Sumter, which existed, was a federal garrison on an island out in the, I believe it's Charleston Harbor. That led to bloodshed, to death on both sides, and lo and behold, we were in a bloody civil war that went on for 4 years and is estimated took upwards of 700,000 lives on both sides. Still the bloodiest war ever fought by Americans on any continent in any way, shape, or form. At the end of the war, the Congress was in no mood to ever have to go through this again. The southern states, the white population was still, even though the slaves had basically been freed, and very soon after the end of the war, Lincoln maneuvered the passing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery forever in all territories within the United States. The Southerners were still angling to maintain control and to not give political power to the newly freed blacks. And so the Congress embarked on enacting the 14th and the 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment does a couple of things. First of all, it makes all residents of every state of the Union citizens of the United States of America. So anyone who was born on United States soil, was considered a citizen of a state, was now also a citizen of the United States of America. And then the 14th Amendment said that every state government must give equal protection and due process of law to every United States citizen. So for the first time, we have a clear statement saying that the federal government can use its power to regulate how the states are going to enact and interact with their citizens within their boundaries. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote to all people regardless of race or beliefs or ethnic origin. Of course, all people in those days basically meant men, and in many states still meant property holders and men. It did not include women or a whole other number of other classifications of people. However, it was a statement basically aimed at saying the southern states had no right to prevent the newly freed black men from African American men from being able to vote and being able to participate in government. And for a brief while after the Civil War, there were, in many of the southern states, there were black governors, there were black majorities in the legislatures, but the Civil War was not an economic war. It did not change the economic structure. The white population basically remained in control of property and particularly land, and very quickly maneuvered different rules and regulations to disenfranchise or to restrict the newly freed populations from participating in government. One of the things that we need to make clear is what type of government do we have? We do not have a democracy as that is defined in history or in political science. A democracy is a system where every citizen gets to vote on every issue, and majority rule is the order of the day. The only pure democracy that ever existed successfully for any period of time was several thousand years ago in Athens. The Greeks were able to maintain a purely democratic system for a number of years, maybe about 100, 150 years, but that quickly fell away into a dictatorship as it becomes very difficult to control a mob or to bring order out of a mob. And democracies also, in a pure system, are woefully inadequate to protect the rights of minorities. If everything is controlled by a 51% majority, if you happen to be part of a minority that only represents 25 or 30 or 40% of the population, you are forever going to be outvoted and forever going to be controlled by the majority, whether it has good intentions or bad intentions. The system that was created by the writers of the Constitution is a republic. And even more so, it is a constitutional republic. A republic is a system that the Romans perfected and used for several hundred years successfully, which is that not every person gets to vote on everything, but that we create an assembly. We create a group of people who are elected by the voters. So the voters get to pick these people, and then they send these folks, their representatives, to basically run the government for them, to enact laws for them, and to manage the affairs of state. So not every individual gets a vote on everything, but every individual voter gets to vote for their representative to the government. Now, I say this is a constitutional republic because even in a republic, there could be great issues if a majority decides that they don't like a minority and they're going to, by majority representation, send representatives that are going to oppress or to control the rights of the minority. So in our system, the writers added the constitutional aspect to it, which is that even though we have this representative body voted in by the people, it is not all powerful. It has limits on its power, and those limits, particularly as the Bill of Rights came to be enacted, those limits are there to protect the rights of all individuals, but particularly of the minority individuals, so that even a majority of the representatives, if they were to agree to abolish the First Amendment, they cannot do that by simple vote. They would have to go through an amendment to the Constitution, which is very difficult to do, and thereby it gives a certain amount of stability and it gives a certain amount of rights to minorities to be able to say to a majority, no, you can't do that. You can't make us do this. You can't take this away from us. And certainly in our system with the separation of powers, there is a court system who will be called upon to interpret the Constitution, to interpret the rights of the minority, and to enter orders to protect them when need be. And that has certainly been part of the case of our history in the last 65 or 70 years, that the court has taken that role and has been active in trying to protect the rights of minorities against the controlling manipulations of a majority that would attempt to limit the rights of the minorities. And again, a large part of what we're going to talk about in this course as we go forward has to do with these issues. That is pretty much all I have to say for going along with the first handout the first week. I will come back. There is a list of Supreme Court terms that I'll go over in a separate video, and then we'll be moving on to talk about some further issues with the structure of the government and how a constitutional republic is supposed to work. So this is it, over and out for the first lecture. We will see you again going over vocabulary of Supreme Court terms in a separate lecture. Thank you.